The scorching sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Eureka, Nevada, as Forrest Mitchell stared at the empty chair across from him, the plate of untouched food growing cold in the late afternoon heat. 2 years had passed since Sarah's death, yet he still couldn't break the habit of setting a place for her at their small kitchen table, a ritual born from 15 years of marriage and shattered by a fever that swept through town like wildfire in the spring of 1876. It was 1878 now, and Forrest, a rancher with calloused hands and a weathered face that had seen 42 summers, pushed the food around his plate without interest. The beef stew he'd made himself tasted like dust in his mouth. His ranch, once bustling with the sounds of hope and possibility, had grown as quiet as his heart these past 2 years. Outside, the Nevada landscape stretched endlessly, his cattle grazing on the parched grass that surrounded his modest homestead 3 miles outside of Eureka. The silver mining boom had brought prosperity to the town, but Forrest remained untouched by the frenzy, content with his cattle and his solitude. He lifted his gaze to the window, where the last rays of sunlight filtered through the threadbare curtains Sarah had sewn years ago. Their home remained largely unchanged since her passing. Her books still lined the small shelf near the fireplace. Her shawl still hung on the peg by the door, and he still slept on his side of the bed, never once crossing the invisible line that had separated them. Forrest pushed back from the table, the legs of his chair scraping against the rough wooden floor. The sound echoed through the empty house as he carried his barely touched meal to the basin. Tomorrow would be another day of the same tending to the cattle, mending fences, and returning to an empty house and a table set for two. Night fell quickly in the Nevada desert, and Forrest sat on his porch with a tin cup of whiskey, watching as stars emerged one by one in the vast sky. The distant howl of a coyote broke the silence, a lonesome sound that seemed to give voice to his own isolation. He was about to head inside when he heard the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching his property. Visitors were rare at this hour. Forrest set his cup down and stood, one hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his hip. The rider approached slowly, and as they came into view, Forrest realized it was a woman, her silhouette unmistakable against the moonlit landscape. She dismounted with graceful ease, and Forrest felt a strange flutter in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in so long that it took him a moment to recognize it as curiosity. The woman led her horse to the water trough beside Forrest's own gelding. "Evening," Forrest called, his voice rough from disuse. "You're a long way from town at this hour." The woman looked up, her face partially hidden by the shadow of her hat. "I apologize for the intrusion," she replied, her voice carrying a hint of an accent he couldn't quite place. "My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I saw your light and hoped I might trouble you for assistance until morning." Forrest hesitated. It had been a long time since he'd had company, even longer since that company had been female. But the code of the West was clear: no one turned away a traveler in need, especially not with night closing in and the nearest neighbor miles away. "Name's Forrest Mitchell," he said, stepping down from the porch. "I've got a spare room and can take a look at your horse's shoe come first light." She stepped forward, removing her hat, and Forrest's breath caught in his throat. In the silver glow of the moon, he could see her clearly now, a woman perhaps in her early 30s, with copper-colored hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes the color of summer sage. "Faith Sullivan," she said, extending a gloved hand. "I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Mitchell." Forrest took her hand, noticing the strength in her grip. "Just Forrest is fine. Come on inside. I've got some stew left if you're hungry." He led her to the house, suddenly conscious of its state, not untidy, but bearing the hallmarks of a man who lived alone. Faith paused at the threshold, her eyes falling on the table with its 2 settings, one clearly abandoned mid-meal. "I've interrupted your supper," she observed, a note of apology in her voice. "Is your wife—" "No wife," Forrest cut in, then softened his tone. "Not anymore. Been 2 years now." Understanding flickered across Faith's face. "I'm sorry for your loss." Forrest simply nodded, unaccustomed to discussing Sarah with strangers. "Please sit. I'll fetch you a plate." As Faith removed her riding coat and took the seat opposite his own Sarah's seat, Forrest felt a strange discomfort, as if some unspoken boundary had been crossed. Yet as he ladled stew into a bowl and set it before her, watching as she gratefully accepted the simple meal, he found himself oddly relieved to have another presence filling the silence of his home. "What brings you to these parts?" he asked, pouring her a cup of coffee from the pot that perpetually simmered on his stove. Faith wrapped her hands around the warm cup, her expression guarded. "I've come to meet my brother. He's working the mines in Eureka. I was supposed to arrive yesterday, but the stagecoach broke down in Carson City, and I had to find alternative transportation." "The mines are dangerous work," Forrest remarked. "A lot of men come seeking fortune and find only hardship." "Franklin is stubborn," Faith said with a hint of a smile. "But he's all the family I have left. When he wrote about striking silver, I decided it was time to join him. I've been teaching in Sacramento for the past 5 years, but—" She trailed off, taking a sip of her coffee. "But," Forrest prompted, surprising himself with his interest. "But sometimes life needs to change," she finished simply. "Even when change is frightening." The words hung between them, and Forrest found himself nodding in understanding. Change had been forced upon him with Sarah's death. He hadn't sought it, hadn't wanted it, but it had come nonetheless. "I'll ride with you into town tomorrow," he offered. "Need to pick up some supplies anyway. I can help you find your brother." "That's very kind," Faith replied. "I wouldn't want to impose further." "No imposition," Forrest assured her, standing to clear away the dishes. "It's what neighbors do." Faith's gaze moved around the room, taking in the modest furnishings. The books on the shelf, the embroidered pillows on the worn sofa, touches of femininity in a space now occupied by a solitary man. Her eyes settled on a small, framed photograph on the mantel. "Is that her?" she asked softly. "Your wife." Forrest followed her gaze to the daguerreotype of Sarah, taken shortly after their wedding. She was smiling, her dark hair arranged in careful curls, wearing the blue dress she had been so proud of. "Yes," he said. "Sarah, fever took her spring before last." Faith's expression was gentle. "She was beautiful." "She was," Forrest agreed, the familiar ache settling in his chest. "She loved this place, built it with me from nothing but dust and dreams." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional creak of the house settling. Faith stifled a yawn, and Forrest realized how late it had grown. "You must be tired from your journey," he said. "I'll show you to the spare room." He led her down the short hallway to the small room that had once been intended for children who never came. It was simple but clean, with a narrow bed and a patchwork quilt Sarah had made during their first winter together. "Thank you," Faith said, pausing at the doorway. "For taking in a stranger." "Not many strangers pass this way," Forrest replied. "Get some rest, Miss Sullivan. We'll head to town at first light." As he walked back to the main room, Forrest felt something shift inside him, a subtle change, like the first breath of spring after a long winter. He glanced back at the closed door behind which his unexpected guest would sleep, then at the table where she had sat in Sarah's chair without the weight of memory crushing her. For the first time in 2 years, Forrest felt the faintest stirring of possibility. Morning arrived with the harsh brilliance typical of the Nevada desert. Forrest had been up since before dawn, tending to his cattle and examining Faith's horse. As he suspected, the animal had thrown a shoe, but the hoof appeared undamaged. He could replace it easily enough in town. He returned to find Faith already awake, her hair freshly braided and her clothes neat despite the previous day's travel. She stood at the stove, stirring something that filled the small house with the forgotten scent of home. "Hope you don't mind," she said when she noticed him watching from the doorway. "I found some cornmeal and thought I might repay your hospitality with breakfast." "Not at all," Forrest replied, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Been a while since anyone used that stove but me." They ate in companionable silence, the golden cornbread and fried eggs a welcome change from Forrest's usual solitary meals. Faith ate with the deliberate appreciation of someone who knew hard times, and Forrest found himself wondering about the life she had left behind in Sacramento. "Your horse needs a new shoe," he said as they cleared the dishes together. "We can get that taken care of in town. Blacksmith owes me a favor." "I'm in your debt, Mr. Mitchell," Faith said. "Forrest," he corrected gently, "and there's no debt, just doing what's right." They set out for Eureka shortly after, the morning sun already hot against their backs. Faith rode beside him on her horse, which Forrest had fitted with a temporary repair until they reached the blacksmith. She sat easily in the saddle, her posture revealing years of experience. "You ride well," he observed. "Not many ladies I know would travel alone through this territory." Faith's smile was tinged with something like pride. "My father was a horse trainer before he passed. He believed his daughters should be as capable as his sons. My mother never quite forgave him for that." "And your mother?" Forrest asked, guiding his gelding around a patch of cacti. "Gone these past 10 years, Faith replied. "Consumption took her the winter I turned 21. My father followed 3 years later." "I'm sorry to hear it," Forrest said, understanding the weight of such losses. "And your brother is all you have left," Faith nodded. "Franklin and I haven't always seen eye to eye, but blood is blood. When he wrote about finding silver, I thought perhaps it was time to mend what was broken between us." Forrest considered her words. "Eureka's grown fast with the silver rush. Lots of men come and go. When did you last hear from him?" 3 months ago," Faith admitted, a flicker of worry crossing her face. "His letter mentioned a claim called the Lucky Strike and a boarding house on Pine Street where he was staying." Forrest knew the boarding house, a respectable establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Hansford. It was a good sign that her brother had found lodging there instead of in one of the many saloons that housed most of the single miners. "We'll find him," Forrest assured her as the first buildings of Eureka came into view. Eureka had transformed dramatically in recent years. What had once been a sleepy outpost was now a bustling mining town, with wooden buildings lining both sides of the main street and constant activity as wagons, riders, and pedestrians moved about their business. The clanging of the stamp mills provided a constant backdrop, processing ore from the numerous mines dotting the surrounding hills. They made their way to the blacksmith first, where a burly man named Peterson greeted Forrest with a hearty handshake. "Mitchell. Rare sight to see you in town twice in 1 month," Peterson boomed, his face smeared with soot from the forge. His eyes shifted to Faith with undisguised curiosity. "My horse threw a shoe," Faith explained before Forrest could speak. "Mr. Mitchell was kind enough to offer assistance." Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly at her well-spoken manner, but he nodded respectfully. "Let's have a look, madam. I'll have you fixed up in no time." While Peterson worked on Faith's horse, Forrest excused himself. "I'll head over to the general store for my supplies." "Meet you back here in half an hour," Faith nodded, and Forrest made his way down the bustling street. Eureka on a weekday was a hive of activity, miners coming and going from shifts, merchants hawking their wares, and the constant rumble of wagons laden with ore. At the general store, Forrest collected the items on his list: coffee, flour, salt, and ammunition for his rifle. As he waited for the proprietor to tally his purchases, he overheard 2 men discussing a recent incident at one of the mines. "Terrible business at the Lucky Strike," one said, shaking his head. 3 men trapped when that shaft collapsed last week." Forrest stiffened, remembering Faith's mention of her brother's claim. "Excuse me," he interrupted. "Did you say the Lucky Strike?" The man turned, assessing Forrest with weary eyes. You know someone there." "Possibly," Forrest replied carefully. "Was anyone hurt in the collapse?" 2 men got out with minor injuries. "One's still missing, presumed dead. Sullivan, I think his name was. Young fellow, not long in town." The name hit Forrest like a physical blow. Sullivan, Faith's brother. He paid for his supplies hastily and made his way back to the blacksmith, his mind racing with how to break such news to a woman who had traveled so far with hope in her heart. Faith was waiting, her newly shod horse looking much improved. Her face brightened when she saw him, then quickly sobered at his expression. "What is it?" she asked, instantly alert. "Has something happened?" Forrest hesitated, unwilling to share such news on the open street. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk." They led their horses to a small cafe near the end of the main street, tying the animals to the hitching post outside. Once seated at a table near the window, Forrest struggled to find the right words. "Faith," he began, using her first name without thinking, "I heard some news at the general store. There was an accident at the Lucky Strike mine about a week ago. A shaft collapsed. The color drained from Faith's face." "Franklin," a man named Sullivan was mentioned, Forrest confirmed gently. They haven't found him yet." Faith's hands trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Then he may still be alive, if they haven't found him." "Faith," Forrest said, reaching across the table to touch her hand briefly. "It's been a week, in a mine collapse." She pulled her hand away, her eyes flashing with sudden determination. "I need to speak with someone in charge, the mine owner or whoever is handling the recovery efforts." Forrest knew the chances of finding her brother alive after a week trapped in a collapsed mine were virtually non-existent. But he recognized the fire of hope that burned in Faith's eyes, the same desperate hope he had clung to as Sarah's fever had worsened, even as the doctor had shaken his head in silent defeat. "The mine superintendent would be at the company office," he said. "I'll take you there." The Silver Basin Mining Company occupied an impressive two-story building on the corner of Main and Cedar Streets. Inside, clerks bent over ledgers while well-dressed men moved between offices with an air of importance. Faith approached the front desk with a composure that Forrest found admirable under the circumstances. "I need to speak with someone about the accident at the Lucky Strike," she stated firmly. "My brother, Franklin Sullivan, was working there." The clerk, a young man with ink-stained fingers, glanced up with a flicker of recognition at the name. "One moment, madam." He disappeared through a door and returned moments later with an older gentleman whose formal attire and commanding presence marked him as someone of authority. "Miss Sullivan," he inquired, extending his hand. "I'm Edward Hargrove, Superintendent of Operations." "I understand you're inquiring about the Lucky Strike incident." Faith shook his hand, her back straight as a ramrod. "Yes, sir. My brother Franklin was working that claim. I've just arrived from California to join him, only to hear there's been an accident." Hargrove's expression softened with genuine sympathy. "I'm very sorry, Miss Sullivan. We did everything possible to reach the men trapped by the collapse. 2 were rescued, but your brother was working deepest in the shaft. The rescue team couldn't get past the debris without risking further collapse. So you've simply abandoned him." Faith's voice carried a sharp edge that seemed to surprise even her. "We had no choice but to seal the shaft," Hargrove explained gently. "After 5 days with no signs of life and dangerous conditions persisting, it was the only responsible decision. Your brother's personal effects were recovered from his boarding house. Mrs. Hansford has been keeping them for next of kin." Faith stood perfectly still, her face a careful mask that revealed nothing of the storm Forrest imagined must be raging within her. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Hargrove," she said finally. "I'll collect my brother's belongings." Outside, in the harsh sunlight, Faith finally allowed her composure to crack. She leaned against the building, her breath coming in short gasps as reality settled over her like a shroud. "I'm so sorry," Forrest said, feeling helpless in the face of her grief. "I know words don't help much at a time like this." Faith looked up at him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "He was all I had left," she whispered. "I came all this way." Without thinking, Forrest placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let's get your brother's things. Then we can decide what comes next." Mrs. Hansford's boarding house was a neat, whitewashed building with green shutters, and a small garden out front, an oasis of domesticity in a town dominated by the rough business of mining. The widow herself answered the door, a plump woman with kind eyes that registered immediate understanding when Faith explained who she was. "I've been expecting someone to come," Mrs. Hansford said, ushering them into a tidy parlor. "Your brother was a good tenant, Miss Sullivan. Quiet, paid his rent on time, never caused any trouble. Not like some of these miners." She disappeared briefly and returned with a small trunk. "This is everything he had. He paid for the room through the end of the month, so there's no hurry if you need some time to make arrangements." Faith thanked her, and Forrest carried the trunk back to their horses. The weight of it, containing all that remained of Franklin Sullivan's life, seemed far too light. "What will you do now?" Forrest asked as they stood on the boardwalk outside the boarding house. Faith looked lost, the determination that had carried her through the mining office now fading into uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have no reason to stay in Eureka, but nowhere else to go either. My position in Sacramento has surely been filled by now." Forrest hesitated, then made a decision that surprised even himself. "Come back to the ranch with me," he offered. "At least until you figure out your next steps. There's plenty of room and, well, it's not good to be alone at a time like this." He knew from experience how crushing solitude could be in the wake of loss, how the silence could become a tangible thing, pressing in from all sides until it was hard to breathe. Faith studied him, perhaps searching for ulterior motives, but Forrest's offer was born solely from understanding and the simple human desire to ease another's suffering. "That's very kind," she said finally, "but I wouldn't want to impose further." "It's no imposition," Forrest assured her. "Truth is, the place could use a woman's touch, even temporarily." He paused, realizing how that might sound. "I mean, I understand," Faith interrupted gently. "And I accept your offer, Mr. Mitchell, but only until I can make proper arrangements." They secured Franklin's trunk to Faith's horse and made their way back through town in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. As they passed the cemetery on the outskirts of Eureka, Faith reined in her horse, gazing at the rows of markers, some elaborate stone monuments, others simple wooden crosses weathering in the Nevada sun. "He won't even have a proper grave," she said softly. "We can still remember him properly," Forrest replied. "When you're ready." Faith nodded, and they continued their journey across the sun-baked landscape to Forrest's ranch. The afternoon heat was beginning to wane by the time they arrived, casting long shadows across the yard. Forrest helped Faith down from her horse, then unloaded Franklin's trunk and carried it into the spare room. When he returned to the main room, he found Faith standing before the photograph of Sarah, studying it with quiet respect. "You were married long?" she asked as she sensed his presence. 15 years, Forrest replied. "Met her when I first came out west in '61 after the war started. I'd enlisted but got a bad leg wound at Bull Run and was discharged. Decided to try my luck out here instead of going back to Pennsylvania." "She must have been very brave," Faith observed. "To build a life out here in the wilderness." Forrest smiled at the memory. "Braver than me, that's certain. She's the one who insisted we could make a go of ranching. I just wanted a small plot to farm, but Sarah, she always thought bigger." Faith turned from the photograph, her expression thoughtful. "It's strange, isn't it, how life turns on small decisions, if Franklin had chosen a different mine or if I had arrived a week earlier." "Can't live in the what-ifs," Forrest said gently. "Drove myself half mad with those after Sarah passed. What if I'd gotten the doctors sooner? What if I'd recognized how serious the fever was earlier?" Faith nodded in understanding. "Does it ever get easier, the loss?" Forrest considered the question honestly. "Not easier," he said finally. "Just different. Some days I wake up and for a moment I forget she's gone. Other days the missing her is just part of breathing." He paused. "I'm sorry, that's not very comforting." "No," Faith disagreed. "It's honest, I appreciate that." They fell into a routine over the following days. Forrest would rise at dawn to tend to the cattle, while Faith took charge of the household tasks without being asked, seemingly grateful for the distraction. She cooked meals that filled the house with forgotten aromas, washed the linens that had grown stiff with disuse, and slowly brought order to corners that Forrest had neglected in his grief. One evening, about a week after her arrival, Forrest returned from checking the herd to find Faith sitting on the porch, a bundle of letters in her lap. The setting sun cast a golden glow over her copper hair, and for a moment, Forrest was struck by how naturally she seemed to fit into the landscape of his life. "Found these in Franklin's trunk," she explained as he sat beside her. "Letters he never sent me. The last one is dated just 3 days before the accident." "Do you want to read them?" Forrest asked gently. Faith nodded. "I already have. He was He was planning to come visit me in Sacramento, said he'd found enough silver to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere safer. Her voice caught. He wanted to mend things between us. Forrest watched as a tear slid down her cheek, catching the last light of day. Without thinking, he reached out and caught it with his thumb, the gesture more intimate than he'd intended. "I'm sorry," he said, withdrawing his hand quickly. Faith looked up at him, her eyes reflecting something complex: grief, certainly, but also a flicker of something warmer. "Don't be," she said softly. "It's nice not to cry alone for once." That night, as Forrest lay in bed staring at the ceiling, he confronted a truth he'd been avoiding. Faith Sullivan's presence had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. It wasn't just the company, the simple relief of having another person in the house. It was Faith herself. With her quiet strength and dignity in the face of loss, her capable hands and thoughtful mind. The realization brought with it a sharp stab of guilt, as if he were somehow betraying Sarah's memory. He rolled onto his side, facing the empty half of the bed that had been hers, and wondered what she would think of the woman sleeping down the hall. Sarah had been practical above all else. "Life's for the living, Forrest," she used to say, but was 2 years long enough to honor her memory? Would it ever be long enough? Mourning brought no clarity, but it did bring work, and Forrest was grateful for the distraction. He spent the day mending a section of fence that had been damaged during the last storm, his muscles aching pleasantly from the labor. When he returned to the house as dusk was falling, he found Faith sitting at the table, a sheet of paper before her and a pen in hand, writing letters. He asked, washing up at the basin by the door. "Making plans," Faith replied. "I've been thinking about what to do next. I could return to Sacramento and try to find another teaching position, but, Forrest prompted when she trailed off. Faith set down the pen. "But it doesn't feel right anymore. I came west to start fresh with Franklin, and even though he's gone, I still want that fresh start." She looked up at Forrest. "Eureka needs a school teacher. I inquired when we were in town last week. The position is open." Forrest felt a strange mix of emotions at her words: relief that she wasn't planning to leave immediately, concern about what it might mean for both of them if she stayed in the area. "You'd be good at it," he said finally. "The children would be lucky to have you." "It would mean finding a place in town," Faith continued. "I couldn't impose on your hospitality indefinitely, and the daily ride would be too much." The thought of Faith leaving his home, even if she remained in the area, left an unexpected hollow feeling in Forrest's chest. He'd grown accustomed to her presence, the sound of her moving about the house, the smell of bread baking in the oven, the quiet conversations they shared in the evenings. "You're not imposing," he said, more forcefully than he intended. Then, softening his tone, he added, "But I understand. You need your own place." Faith studied him, her head tilted slightly. "Forrest," she said, using his first name with a familiarity that sent a warm current through him, "what exactly are we doing here?" The directness of the question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I came here as a stranger in need of help, then as a woman grieving her brother. But it's been nearly 2 weeks now, and—" She hesitated. "I'm not blind to the way you look at me sometimes, nor am I unaware of my own feelings." Forrest felt heat rise to his face, unaccustomed to such frankness from a woman. "I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. You haven't," Faith interrupted gently. "But I need to know if these feelings, whatever they may be, are merely gratitude on my part and kindness on yours, or if there's something more. Because if I'm to stay in Eureka, we should be clear with each other." Forrest took a seat across from her, his heart hammering in his chest. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "I wasn't looking for anything when you showed up at my door. I've been content enough in my solitude, or so I thought. And now," Faith pressed, her eyes never leaving his. "Now I find myself thinking about you when you're not in the room," Forrest said honestly. "Wondering what you're thinking, what you'll say next. It's been a long time since I've felt that curiosity about another person." Faith's expression softened. "I feel it too," she confessed. "And it frightens me a little. I came here looking for family and found grief instead. I wasn't expecting to find whatever this is between us." "What do you want to do about it?" Forrest asked, aware that they were venturing into territory as uncharted as the frontier itself. Faith considered the question. I think we should give it time. I'll take the teaching position, find lodgings in town, and we'll see what develops naturally without the pressure of living under the same roof. It was a sensible proposal, and Forrest nodded in agreement, even as a part of him wanted to ask her to stay, to see what might grow between them in the quiet evenings on his porch and the peaceful mornings at his table. I'll ride with you to town tomorrow, he offered. Help you get settled. Faith smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen since she'd learned of her brother's fate. Thank you for everything, Forrest. Not everyone would have opened their home to a stranger the way you did. Not everyone would have been worth opening it for, he replied simply. The following morning, they rode to Eureka together, the future stretching before them as vast and unpredictable as the Nevada sky. Faith had an appointment with the town council to discuss the teaching position, while Forrest had business at the bank. Meet you at the cafe around noon. He suggested as they parted ways on Main Street. Faith nodded, adjusting her hat against the bright sun. I should be finished by then. Wish me luck. You don't need it, Forrest assured her, but good luck all the same. He watched her walk away, her posture straight and determined, before turning toward the bank. His business there was straightforward, depositing the proceeds from his recent cattle sale and discussing a loan for expanding his herd. But his thoughts kept drifting to Faith and the conversation that had passed between them the previous evening. It had been so long since he'd considered a future that included anyone but himself. The possibility both exhilarated and terrified him. What if he had forgotten how to love properly? What if the part of him capable of that depth of feeling had died with Sarah? By the time Forrest finished his banking business, it was nearly noon. He made his way to the cafe, claiming a table near the window where he could watch for Faith's approach. The establishment was busy with the lunchtime crowd, miners coming off the morning shift, shopkeepers taking a brief respite, and the occasional respectable lady out for a social call. He was so preoccupied with his thoughts that he almost missed the commotion outside. Raised voices, the sound of running feet, and then, most alarmingly, a woman's scream. Forrest was on his feet immediately, pushing through the curious patrons gathering at the doorway. Outside, a crowd had formed around something or someone in the street. Forrest shouldered his way through, dread building in his chest. At the center of the commotion, Faith knelt beside a young boy who lay sprawled in the dust, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. A runaway horse was being calmed several yards away, while a wagon with a broken wheel tilted precariously nearby. He jumped in front of the horse, someone in the crowd was explaining. The animal was spooked, heading straight for a group of children. This young lady pulled most of them away, but the boy was hit. Faith looked up as Forrest approached, her face pale but composed. Forrest, we need to get him to a doctor. His leg is broken, and I'm worried about internal injuries. Without hesitation, Forrest scooped the unconscious boy into his arms. Where's the doctor's office? End of Cedar Street, someone called. Dr. Wagner. Forrest set off immediately, Faith hurrying alongside him. The boy couldn't have been more than 10 years old, his face alarmingly white beneath a shock of dark hair. What happened? Forrest asked as they hurried down the street. A delivery wagon lost its wheel, Faith explained breathlessly. The horse panicked and bolted. There were children playing nearby. I managed to pull most of them out of the way, but Tommy here, she gestured to the boy in Forrest's arms. He was trying to help a younger child, so brave and so foolish. They reached the doctor's office, a modest building with a shingle that read Luther Wagner, M.D. Faith pounded on the door, which was opened almost immediately by a harried-looking young woman. Medical emergency, Faith said quickly. Is the doctor in? In the back, the woman replied, holding the door wide. I'm his nurse. Bring the patient this way. They followed her to a small examination room where a middle-aged man with spectacles and rolled-up shirt sleeves was washing his hands in a basin. What have we here? He asked, immediately professional as he assessed the unconscious boy. Wagon accident, Forrest explained, laying the child gently on the examination table. His leg's broken for sure, maybe more, Dr. Wagner nodded, already examining the boy with practiced hands. Mary, prepare for setting a fracture, and get my surgical kit ready just in case. The nurse hurried to comply while the doctor continued his examination. You family? He asked, glancing up at Forrest and Faith. No, Faith replied. I'm the new school teacher, or will be if the council approves my appointment. I was just leaving the meeting when the accident happened. This is Tommy Griffith, the nurse supplied as she returned with bandages and splints. His father works at the assay office. Mother died last year, doctor. Wagner's expression grew more concerned as he palpated the boy's abdomen. There's some rigidity here that I don't like, possible internal bleeding. He looked up at Forrest and Faith. One of you should fetch his father, immediately. I'll go, Forrest volunteered. Where's the assay office? 2 blocks north, brick building with green trim, the nurse directed. Forrest squeezed Faith's hand briefly, then hurried out. The assay office was easy to find, and upon explaining the situation, he was quickly introduced to James Griffith, a tall, thin man whose face drained of color at the news of his son's accident. They returned to the doctor's office at her run, arriving to find Faith sitting in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She rose when they entered. How is he? Griffith asked, his voice tight with fear. The doctor is still examining him, Faith replied gently. He regained consciousness briefly. He was asking for you. Griffith nodded gratefully and disappeared into the examination room, leaving Forrest and Faith alone in the small waiting area. You were very brave, Forrest said, taking a seat beside her. Quick thinking, too. Those other children might have been seriously hurt if not for you. Faith shook her head. I just reacted. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Forrest disagreed. Takes a special kind of person to run toward danger instead of away from it. They fell silent, the gravity of the situation weighing on them both. Faith's hands were trembling slightly, and Forrest reached over to cover them with his own. You're in shock, he observed. Let me get you some water. He found the nurse and returned with a cup of water, which Faith accepted gratefully. As she drank, Forrest noticed a tear sliding down her cheek. Hey now, he said softly, you did everything right. The boys got a fighting chance because of you. Faith wiped away the tear with the back of her hand. It's not that, she said. It's just when I saw that wagon heading for those children, all I could think was not again, not another life cut short before its time. Forrest understood immediately. She was thinking of her brother, of the cruel randomness of death and how quickly it could snatch away those we care about. Life's a fragile thing, he agreed. Makes you wonder why we bother sometimes. Faith looked at him, her eyes clearing slightly. No, it makes me understand exactly why we bother, because every moment matters, every kindness, every connection. Before Forrest could respond, the examination room door opened, and Dr. Wagner emerged, wiping his hands on a towel. The boy's stabilized, he announced. Broken tibia, clean break fortunately, some internal bruising, but no signs of significant bleeding. He's young and healthy, should make a full recovery with proper care. The relief was palpable. Faith closed her eyes briefly in silent gratitude, while Forrest felt a tension he hadn't realized he was holding release from his shoulders. His father's with him now, the doctor continued. They'll need to stay here tonight for observation, but I expect they can go home tomorrow. He turned to Faith with newfound respect. Quick action like yours probably saved more than one life today, Miss Sullivan, Faith supplied. Faith Sullivan, Miss Sullivan. Eureka would be fortunate to have someone like you teaching its children. After assuring themselves that Tommy was indeed on the mend, Forrest and Faith finally left the doctor's office. The afternoon was waning, the shadows lengthening across the dusty street. Quite a day, Forrest remarked as they walked back toward the center of town. Did you get a chance to finish your meeting with the council before all this happened? Faith nodded, a small smile playing at her lips despite the drama of the afternoon. They offered me the position. I start next Monday. Congratulations, Forrest said sincerely. Though after today I expect half the town would riot if they didn't hire you, Faith laughed softly. Hardly the way I plan to introduce myself to the community. Best way there is, Forrest countered. Shows your character. They reached the spot where they had left their horses, and Forrest hesitated. Have you had a chance to look for lodgings yet? Faith shook her head. That was next on my list before the accident. The school has a small cottage attached for the teacher, but it needs some repairs before it's habitable. Then stay, Forrest said, the words coming out before he could reconsider them, at the ranch, until the cottage is ready, or longer if you want. Faith looked up at him, searching his face. Forrest, we agreed. I know what we agreed, he interrupted gently. And if you want to stick to that plan, I'll respect it. But today, seeing you with those children, the way you didn't hesitate to help that boy, it made me realize something. What's that? Faith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. That life's too short and too unpredictable to waste time being cautious with our hearts, Forrest said. I've spent 2 years living with a ghost, Faith, setting a place at my table for a woman who's never coming back. And then you showed up at my door, and for the first time I started thinking about tomorrow instead of yesterday. Faith's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I came looking for my brother, for the only family I had left I never expected. Neither did I, Forrest admitted, but here we are. And I'm asking you to give us a real chance, not separated by town and country, but together, seeing what might grow between us. Faith was quiet for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. It won't be simple, she said finally. We've both lost so much, we're both carrying scars. Simple is overrated, Forrest replied with a small smile, and scars just mean we've survived something. Faith stepped closer, close enough that Forrest could see the flecks of gold in her green eyes. If I stay, she said softly, it wouldn't be proper unless. Forrest prompted, his heart hammering in his chest. Unless there was an understanding between us. A formal one, Faith clarified. Forrest took her hands in his, aware they were standing in the middle of Eureka's main street, visible to anyone who cared to look. Faith Sullivan, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. I'm not a man for flowery words or grand gestures, but I know what it feels like to find something unexpected and precious. I'm asking if you'll consider a future with me, not just as my guest, but as my wife, when we're both ready for that step. Faith's smile bloomed slowly, like a desert flower after rain. I think, she said, that I would like that very much, Forrest Mitchell. The ride back to the ranch was filled with a different kind of silence than their journey into town had been, not tense with unspoken feelings, but comfortable with newfound understanding. The setting sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the beauty of it striking Forrest anew, as if he were seeing the familiar terrain through different eyes. As they approached the ranch house, Forrest was suddenly conscious of how Faith might see it not as the temporary shelter it had been to her these past weeks, but as a potential home. The weathered boards needed paint, the garden Sarah had once tended had gone mostly to weeds, and the porch steps sagged slightly from years of neglect. It needs work, he said as they dismounted. The house, Sarah always had plans for it that I never got around to after she was gone. Faith looked at the modest structure with assessing eyes. It has good bones, she said, and it already feels more like home than anywhere I've lived in years. They settled into a new routine over the following days. Faith divided her time between preparing for her teaching position and making small improvements to the house, hanging fresh curtains, clearing the overgrown garden, bringing order to spaces that had been neglected. Forrest found himself working with renewed purpose, repairing the sagging porch steps, repainting the exterior, and clearing away the weeds that had encroached on Sarah's garden. It was as if Faith's presence had awakened not just his heart but his hands as well, reminding him of the satisfaction that came from creating and maintaining a home. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast Nevada sky. Sometimes they talked about their pasts, their losses, their hopes for the future. Other times they simply sat in companionable silence, the space between them comfortable rather than empty. One such evening, about 2 weeks after the accident in town, Faith was mending one of Forrest's shirts while he whittled idly at a piece of pine wood. "What are you making?" she asked, Noticing the emerging shape beneath his careful knife, Forrest examined the small carving. Not sure yet. Maybe a horse. My father taught me whittling when I was a boy, said it was good for patience. Faith smiled. My father believed in practical skills too. He taught Franklin and me to ride, to hunt, to find our way by the stars. Our mother thought it terribly improper for a girl to know such things, but I've never regretted learning them. You mention your brother often, Forrest observed gently, but you rarely speak of your parents. Faith's hands stilled on her mending. They weren't particularly happy people, she said after a moment. My father was restless, always looking for the next opportunity, the next adventure. My mother was the opposite, craving stability, propriety, the comfort of familiar surroundings. Sounds like a difficult match, Forrest remarked. They loved each other once, I think, Faith continued. But over time, their differences wore them both down. By the time I was old enough to understand such things, they were like strangers sharing a house. She looked up at Forrest. It's why I've always believed that compatibility matters more than passion in a marriage. Passion fades, but friendship endures. Forrest considered her words. Sarah and I were fortunate, we had both. She was my best friend first, then my wife. Made the hard years easier, having someone who understood me without words. Faith's expression grew thoughtful. Do you think she would mind about us, I mean? It was a question Forrest had asked himself many times over the past weeks. No, he said finally. Sarah wasn't one to begrudge happiness to anyone, least of all me. She used to tease that I'd be lost without her, said I'd better find someone sensible if anything ever happened to her. Faith laughed softly. She sounds like a remarkable woman. She was, Forrest agreed. And she would have liked you. The simple statement hung in the air between them, acknowledgement that the past was not forgotten but had made space for the present, for possibility. The following Monday marked Faith's first day as Eureka's schoolteacher. Forrest drove her into town in his wagon, both of them conscious of the milestone the day represented. Nervous? He asked as they approached the small schoolhouse at the edge of town. Faith smoothed her skirts, her expression a mix of anticipation and determination. A little, but mostly excited. It's been too long since I've had a classroom of my own. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building with rows of desks facing a larger desk and blackboard at the front. Children of various ages were already gathering in the yard outside, eyeing the new teacher with undisguised curiosity. Among them, sitting on a bench with his leg in a cast, was Tommy Griffith, the boy from the wagon accident. He brightened when he saw Faith, waving enthusiastically. "Miss Sullivan," he called. "Pa said I could come even with my bad leg, said learning's more important than comfort." Faith smiled warmly, approaching the boy. "Your father is a wise man, Tommy, but we'll make sure you're comfortable too, perhaps a cushion for that bench." As Faith greeted the other children and their parents, Forrest watched from a slight distance, struck by how naturally she assumed her role as teacher, authoritative yet kind, establishing boundaries while making each child feel seen and valued. "She's going to be good for this town," a voice said beside him. Forrest turned to find James Griffith, Tommy's father, standing next to him. "Not just for the children either. She already has been," Forrest agreed. Griffith studied him with knowing eyes. "Word travels fast in a small town, Mitchell. People have noticed the changes in you since Miss Sullivan arrived." Forrest felt a flush creep up his neck. "That obvious, is it?" Griffith chuckled. "Only to those of us who know what it's like to find love after thinking that part of life was over." His expression sobered slightly. "I lost my Mary 2 years ago, thought the world had ended. Then one day I looked at Tommy and realized I was still here, still breathing, still responsible for making whatever life we had left as good as possible." The bell rang, signaling the start of the school day. Faith gathered the children and led them inside, pausing at the door to wave at Forrest with a smile that warmed him from the inside out. "I'll be back at 3 to drive you home," he called. Faith nodded. "I'll be waiting," she replied, a promise in her voice that extended far beyond the end of the school day. As the weeks passed, Faith divided her time between the schoolhouse in town and the ranch, which increasingly felt like their shared home rather than just Forrest's. The teacher's cottage remained in disrepair, a fact that neither of them seemed particularly motivated to address. Their relationship deepened with each passing day, built on mutual respect and understanding, on shared work and quiet conversations. They moved slowly, honoring their respective pasts while cautiously embracing the future that seemed to be unfolding before them. The town of Eureka embraced Faith as one of their own. Parents appreciated her dedication to their children's education, while the children themselves adored her creative approach to learning. Even the minors, many of whom had left families behind in other places, tipped their hats respectfully when they passed the schoolmarm on the street. October arrived with cooler temperatures and the promise of winter on the horizon. Forrest had spent the previous weeks preparing the ranch for the colder months, chopping firewood, reinforcing the barn, ensuring the cattle had adequate shelter. One crisp Saturday morning, he returned from town with supplies and an unexpected package, which he presented to Faith as she was kneading bread dough in the kitchen. "What's this?" she asked, wiping flour from her hands. "Open it and see," Forrest replied, enjoying the curiosity in her eyes. Faith untied the string and carefully unwrapped the brown paper to reveal a beautiful leather-bound book. Opening it, she discovered blank pages. "A journal," she guessed. "Not exactly," Forrest said, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I thought." "Well, Sarah used to keep a book of recipes and household remedies. She said every home should have one, passed down through generations. Since hers was lost in the fire that took the original house, before we built this one, I thought perhaps you might like to start a new one." Faith's expression softened as she understood the significance of the gift, not just a practical item, but an acknowledgement of her place in this home, in Forrest's life, and in the future they were building together. "It's perfect," she said, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Thank you." She reached up and, with a boldness that still surprised him, pressed a soft kiss to his cheek. It was a simple gesture, but intimate in a way that made Forrest's heart race. They had been careful with physical affection, both aware of propriety and their own need for a solid foundation before taking such steps. Forrest caught her hand as she began to pull away. "Faith," he said, his voice low and serious, "I've been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she teased gently. He smiled, then continued. "I've been thinking it's time to make things official between us, if you're ready." Faith's eyes widened slightly. "Are you proposing, Forrest Mitchell?" "Not very romantically," he admitted with a rueful laugh. "But yes, I am. I love you, Faith Sullivan. I didn't think I'd ever say those words to another woman after Sarah, but there they are, and I mean them with all my heart." Faith's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was radiant. "And I love you," she replied. "I came west looking for family and found something I never expected, a second chance at happiness." Forrest drew her closer, his hands gentle on her waist. "Is that a yes, then?" "Yes," Faith said simply. "Yes to being your wife, to building a life with you, to whatever the future holds for us." Their first kiss was tender and unhurried, a promise exchanged without words. When they finally drew apart, Forrest rested his forehead against hers, feeling a peace he had thought lost to him forever. "When?" he asked. "The wedding, I mean," Faith considered, "before winter sets in properly." "Perhaps mid-November. That would give us time to prepare, and the children could attend before the worst weather makes travel difficult for those who live farther out." Forrest nodded in agreement. "Mid-November it is. Nothing fancy, though?" "Nothing fancy," Faith confirmed with a smile. "Just us, our friends, and the promise of tomorrow." Word of their engagement spread quickly through Eureka and the surrounding ranches. The community responded with genuine pleasure. Forrest had been respected but isolated in his grief for too long, and Faith had quickly become a beloved figure in the town. The preparations for the wedding were simple but meaningful. Faith sewed her own dress, a practical but elegant gown of deep blue wool that brought out the color of her eyes. Forrest commissioned a new suit from the town tailor, feeling somewhat self-conscious about the fuss, but wanting to honor the importance of the day. They decided to hold the ceremony in the schoolhouse, which Faith students enthusiastically decorated with pine boughs and ribbons. Reverend Collins, who traveled a circuit that included Eureka every few weeks, adjusted his schedule to be present for the occasion. The night before the wedding, Forrest sat alone on the porch of what would soon be officially their home, watching as the first snowflakes of the season began to drift lazily from the darkening sky. The door opened behind him, and Faith stepped out, wrapped in a shawl against the chill. "Penny for your thoughts," she said, settling beside him on the bench. Forrest smiled, taking her hand in his. "Just thinking about how life changes when you least expect it. A year ago, I couldn't have imagined sitting here with you, planning our wedding, having second thoughts." Faith asked, her tone light but with a hint of genuine question beneath. "Not a single one," Forrest assured her. "You?" Faith shook her head. "No, though I do wonder sometimes about the future, about children." It was a topic they had discussed only in passing, the possibility of starting a family together. Forrest was in his 40s, Faith in her 30s. They were not young newlyweds with decades ahead of them. "I'd like that," Forrest said honestly. "Children, I mean, Sarah and I. We tried, but it never happened for us. I'd given up on the idea until you came along." Faith leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I wasn't sure if you would want to start over at our ages." "It's not starting over," Forrest corrected gently. "It's continuing. Building on what we've already lived, what we've learned." He paused. "But even if children don't come, Faith, you're enough. This life we're building together is enough." Faith smiled, the expression visible even in the gathering darkness. "I feel the same way. Though I think you'd make a wonderful father." "And you're already a wonderful teacher," Forrest replied. "Motherhood would just be an extension of that." They sat in companionable silence as the snow began to fall more heavily, blanketing the world around them in pristine white. "I should go," Faith said finally. "Mrs. Hansford is expecting me. Bad luck for the groom to see the bride the night before the wedding, or so she insists." Forrest laughed. "Seems a bit late for that, considering you've been living under my roof for months." "In separate rooms," Faith reminded him primly, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "We've been very proper, Mr. Mitchell." "Until tomorrow," Forrest said, his voice deepening slightly. Faith blushed, visible even in the dim light from the window. "Until tomorrow," she agreed. He watched as she gathered her things, the small carpet bag containing her wedding dress and personal items. Mrs. Hansford, the boarding house proprietress who had kept Franklin's belongings, had insisted that Faith spend the night before the wedding at her establishment, to do things properly. Forrest drove her into town through the gently falling snow, both of them wrapped in blankets against the cold. The streets of Eureka were quiet, most residents already inside by their fires as evening settled over the town. "I'll see you at the schoolhouse," Faith said as they arrived at the boarding house. 2:00. "I'll be the one in the new suit," Forrest replied with a smile. She leaned over and kissed him quickly, then hurried inside, greeted at the door by the beaming Mrs. Hansford. Forrest returned to the ranch, acutely aware of Faith's absence. The house seemed emptier without her, a reminder of how thoroughly she had filled the spaces left by grief and solitude. Tomorrow, he thought as he banked the fire for the night, she would return as his wife, and they would begin the next chapter of their lives together. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the world outside transformed by the night's snowfall into a glistening white landscape. Forrest rose early, tended to the necessary ranch chores, then bathed and dressed with unusual care. The new suit felt stiff and formal, but as he regarded his reflection in the small mirror, he had to admit the tailor had done fine work. He rode into Eureka with time to spare, wanting to check that everything was prepared at the schoolhouse before the ceremony. The building was warm and inviting, transformed by the decorations and the addition of extra benches borrowed from the church to accommodate the guests. People began to arrive shortly after 1:00. Ranchers and their families from the surrounding area, miners and shopkeepers from town, and of course, Faith students, scrubbed clean and unusually subdued in their Sunday best. At precisely 2:00, a hush fell over the gathered community as the door opened and Faith entered on the arm of James Griffith, who had offered to stand in as her escort in the absence of family. Her blue dress complemented her copper hair, which was arranged in a simple but elegant style beneath a small hat adorned with a single white flower. Forrest, waiting at the front of the room with Reverend Collins, felt his breath catch at the sight of her. Faith's eyes met his, and the smile that bloomed on her face held all the promise he could have asked for. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful, their vows exchanged with clear voices and unwavering conviction. When Reverend Collins pronounced them husband and wife, the schoolhouse erupted in cheers and applause, the children particularly enthusiastic in their approval of their teacher's happiness. The celebration continued with a community supper in the town hall, where tables groaned under the weight of dishes contributed by nearly every household in Eureka. There was music and dancing, laughter and congratulations, the whole town seemingly determined to mark the occasion in proper style. As the evening progressed, Forrest found a quiet moment with his new wife, drawing her away from the festivities to a relatively private corner. "Happy?" he asked, taking both her hands in his. Faith's eyes shone with contentment. "Completely, and you?" "More than I thought possible," Forrest admitted. "Though I'm about ready to take my wife home if she's willing." Faith laughed softly. "I thought you'd never ask. It's been a wonderful celebration, but it's time for us to begin our life together," Forrest finished for her. "Properly." They made their goodbyes, accepting final congratulations and well wishes before setting off in Forrest's wagon toward the ranch, their home now, in every sense of the word. The night was clear, stars brilliant overhead and the snow glistening in the moonlight. "It's beautiful," Faith murmured, nestled against Forrest's side beneath the blankets. "Like the world has been made new just for us." Forrest felt the truth of her words deep in his heart. The familiar landscape did indeed seem transformed, not just by the snow but by the promise of the future stretching before them, a future he had once thought forever closed to him. When they reached the ranch, Forrest helped Faith down from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. "Forrest," she laughed, her arms going around his neck, "you'll hurt your back." "Worth it," he replied with a grin, kicking the door closed behind them. Tradition matters. Inside, the house was warm, the fire having been banked to last through their absence. Forrest set Faith gently on her feet but kept his arms around her, suddenly aware that they were truly alone as husband and wife for the first time. Faith seemed to sense his momentary hesitation. "It's just us now," she said softly. "No need to be nervous." Forrest smiled, brushing a strand of copper hair from her face. "Not nervous," he corrected, "just savoring the moment. I want to remember everything about tonight." Faith reached up to loosen his tie. "Then perhaps we should make it memorable," she suggested, a new boldness in her voice that sent a thrill through him. Their first night as husband and wife was indeed memorable, tender, and passionate by turns, a discovery of each other that went beyond the physical to something deeper, a connection that affirmed their decision to build a life together. Afterward, as Faith slept peacefully beside him, Forrest watched the play of moonlight across her face and marveled at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the lonely man setting a table for a ghost to a husband holding his wife in the warmth of their shared bed, it seemed both miraculous and somehow inevitable, as if their paths had always been destined to cross. Winter settled over Eureka and the surrounding ranches with its usual severity, but for Forrest and Faith, the cold months passed in a haze of domestic contentment. They established new routines together, Faith continuing to teach at the schoolhouse while Forrest tended to the ranch, their evenings spent in comfortable companionship by the fire. As the harshest weather began to ease with the approach of spring, Faith made an announcement that would change their lives once again. "Forrest," she said one evening as they sat at the kitchen table, the remains of supper before them, "I have something to tell you." There was a quality in her voice that immediately caught his attention, a mixture of joy and nervousness that he had rarely heard from his typically composed wife. "What is it?" he asked, setting aside the ranch ledger he had been reviewing. Faith took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly before her. "I believe I'm going to have a baby, our baby." The words hung in the air between them, momentous and transformative. Forrest stared at her, processing what she had said, then a slow smile spread across his face. "A baby," he repeated, the word filled with wonder. "You're sure?" Faith nodded. "Reasonably so. I've missed my monthly twice now, and there are other signs. Dr. Wagner confirmed my suspicions yesterday when I was in town." Forrest rose from his chair and moved around the table to kneel beside her, taking her hands in his. "Faith Mitchell," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "you continue to bring miracles into my life when I least expect them." Tears glistened in Faith's eyes. "You're happy then?" "Happy doesn't begin to cover it," Forrest assured her, drawing her into a gentle embrace. "When?" "Late summer, Dr. Wagner thinks. August, perhaps." Forrest placed a hand tentatively on her still flat stomach, awed by the knowledge that their child was growing within her. At 43, he had long ago resigned himself to remaining childless, yet here was another chance he had never dared to hope for. "What about the school?" he asked. Knowing how much Faith's teaching meant to her, she smiled, touching his cheek affectionately. "I've already spoken with the town council. They've agreed to let me continue until the end of the school year in June, and they'll find a temporary replacement for the fall term. I can return after the baby is a few months old, if we decide that's best." Forrest nodded, appreciating as always Faith's practical approach to life's challenges. "Whatever you want," he said, "we'll make it work." The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Forrest threw himself into readying the house for the new arrival, enlarging the small third bedroom that would become the nursery. Crafting a cradle from pine wood with his own hands, ensuring the ranch would be secure and profitable enough to support their growing family. Faith, meanwhile, continued teaching while gradually making arrangements for her temporary replacement, a young woman named Emily Baker, who had recently arrived in Eureka with her mining engineer husband. Faith took great care in preparing lesson plans and materials that would ensure her students' education would continue smoothly in her absence. As spring gave way to summer, Faith's condition became more obvious. Her students were both fascinated and delighted by their teacher's expanding waistline, asking innocent, but sometimes startlingly direct questions that made Faith laugh when she recounted them to Forrest in the evenings. "Tommy Griffith asked today if I had swallowed a watermelon seed," she told him one night as they sat on the porch, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in shades of orange and pink. "And little Susie Peterson wanted to know if the baby could hear her if she spoke to my stomach." Forrest smiled, his hand resting gently on the swell of Faith's abdomen. "Can it hear us, I mean?" "Dr. Wagner says it's possible," Faith replied. "He says the baby is fully formed now, just growing stronger for the journey into the world. Then perhaps we should talk to him." "Or her," Forrest suggested. "Him or her?" Faith questioned with a raised eyebrow. "Do you have a preference?" Forrest considered the question honestly. "No," he decided. "Boy or girl, it doesn't matter. Just healthy and happy is all I ask." Faith covered his hand with her own. "I've been thinking about names," she admitted. "If it's a boy, I thought perhaps Franklin, after my brother." Forrest nodded in understanding. "Franklin Mitchell has a good sound to it, and if it's a girl," Faith was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking maybe Sarah, to honor her memory." Forrest felt his throat tighten with emotion at the suggestion. "You wouldn't mind that?" "Not at all," Faith assured him. "She was an important part of your life, of this home. It seems fitting that her name should continue." Forrest kissed her then, overcome by the generosity of spirit that continued to define the woman he had married. "Sarah Faith Mitchell," he murmured. "It's perfect." The summer of 1879 proved to be one of the hottest on record in Nevada. As July gave way to August, Faith found the heat increasingly difficult to bear, especially in her advanced condition. Forrest did everything he could to make her comfortable, keeping the house as cool as possible, ensuring she rested during the hottest part of the day, even constructing a small awning over their porch to provide additional shade. Dr. Wagner visited regularly, assuring them that despite the discomfort, both Faith and the baby were progressing well. Still, Forrest couldn't help but worry, memories of Sarah's illness never far from his mind despite the entirely different circumstances. "You're hovering again," Faith observed one afternoon as Forrest brought her yet another glass of cool water. "Can't help it," he admitted with a rueful smile. "Never been a father before, don't know the rules." Faith reached for his hand, drawing him down to sit beside her on the sofa. "There are no rules, Forrest, just love and patience and trust. I'm fine, truly, uncomfortable, yes, but that's to be expected." Forrest nodded, trying to take her reassurance to heart. "Just a few more weeks," he said, as much to himself as to her. In fact, it was less than a week later that Faith woke Forrest in the pre-dawn hours, her face tense with discomfort. "It's time," she said simply. "The baby is coming." Forrest was instantly alert, the plan they had discussed many times springing into action. He helped Faith into a comfortable position, then rode swiftly into town to fetch Dr. Wagner and Mrs. Hansford, who had agreed to assist with the birth. By the time they returned, Faith's labor had progressed significantly. Dr. Wagner took charge with calm efficiency, directing Forrest to heat water and prepare clean linens while Mrs. Hansford stayed by Faith's side, offering comfort and practical support. "Everything looks to be proceeding normally," the doctor assured Forrest. "First babies often take their time." This could be a long day. Indeed, the sun rose and climbed high in the sky as Faith's labor continued. Forrest alternated between practical tasks and sitting beside his wife, holding her hand through the increasingly powerful contractions that racked her body. "You're doing beautifully," he murmured as she gripped his hand with surprising strength during a particularly intense moment. "I'm so proud of you." Faith managed a tired smile between pains. "Not much choice, now that we've started this," she gasped, as afternoon waned toward evening. Dr. Wagner announced that the birth was imminent. "The baby's head is crowning," he said. "A few more good pushes, Mrs. Mitchell, and you'll be meeting your child." Forrest watched in awe and terror as Faith gathered her remaining strength for the final stage of labor. Her face was flushed, her hair damp with perspiration, but her eyes were clear and determined. "One more," Dr. Wagner encouraged after several exhausting efforts. "One more good push." Faith bore down with a primal sound that Forrest had never heard from her before, and then, miracle of miracles, a new cry filled the room, thin and indignant and perfect. "A girl," Dr. Wagner announced, lifting the squalling infant for them to see. "A beautiful, healthy girl." Tears streamed unashamedly down Forrest's face as the doctor placed the tiny, red-faced bundle on Faith's chest. "Sarah," he whispered. "Sarah Faith Mitchell." Faith's eyes, though exhausted, shone with joy as she cradled their daughter. "Hello, little one," she murmured. "We've been waiting for you." The hours that followed passed in a blur of emotion and activity. Dr. Wagner ensured that Faith was stable and recovering well, while Mrs. Hansford helped clean and swaddle the newborn. Forrest moved between them, alternately checking on his wife and marveling at his daughter, hardly able to believe that this perfect creature was truly theirs. As night fell, the doctor and Mrs. Hansford finally departed, promising to return the following day to check on mother and child. Forrest found himself alone with his family, his wife resting peacefully in their bed, his newborn daughter sleeping in the cradle he had crafted with his own hands. He stood in the doorway, watching them both in the gentle glow of the lamp, and felt his heart expand with a love so profound it was almost painful. This was what Sarah had wanted for him. He realized not the endless vigil of grief he had kept for 2 years, but the courage to open his heart again, to build something new from the ashes of what had been lost. "Thank you," he whispered, the words meant for Sarah, for Faith, for the tiny miracle that was his daughter, and for whatever benevolent fate had brought them all into his life. In the years that followed, the Mitchell family flourished. Sarah Faith grew into a strong, curious child with her mother's copper hair and her father's steady nature. Faith returned to teaching when Sarah was 6 months old, bringing the baby with her to school 3 days a week, an arrangement that delighted her students and set a progressive precedent for working mothers in Eureka. When Sarah was 2, she was joined by a brother, Franklin James Mitchell. born on a crisp autumn day with considerably less drama than his sister's arrival. The family was complete, their home filled with the joyful chaos of young children and the deep, abiding love between Faith and Forrest that had only strengthened with time and shared experience. On quiet evenings after the children were asleep, Faith and Forrest would sometimes sit on the porch where they had first begun to know each other, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this point. Did you ever imagine this? Faith would ask, gesturing to the thriving ranch, the well-tended home, the evidence of their life together. When I showed up at your door that night. And Forrest, holding the hand of the woman who had helped him rediscover joy after loss, would shake his head and reply with perfect honesty, "Never, but I'm grateful every day that you knocked." For in that knock had been the sound of tomorrow, not just for a lonely cowboy who had set a table for two out of habit and heartache, but for a woman seeking family and finding love, and for the children who would grow up knowing the story of how their parents found each other against all odds in the vast, unforgiving beauty of the Nevada desert. It was a story they would pass down through generations, a testament to the healing power of love and the unexpected ways in which life could begin anew. Even when all hope seemed lost, a reminder that sometimes the end of one chapter is simply the beginning of another, more beautiful story waiting to be told.